Disproportionately high rates of youth self-harm and suicide in Indigenous communities worldwide were in the spotlight as the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues held its 14th session in New York. The UN Youth Center spoke with some of the participants to find out why they think Indigenous youth are harming themselves at rates higher than the rest of the population and what can be done to stop the trend. Growing up as an Indigenous person in today's world can be stressful. Indigenous youth often experience frustration as they try to strike a balance between their traditional culture and modern society. This can result in a sense of marginalization from both worlds and feelings of anger, hopelessness, and depression, leading sometimes to self-harm and suicide. Victor Lopez Carmen from Tucson, Arizona, of the Yaqui Nation and the Lakota Sioux, was attending the Permanent Forum as a member of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. He spoke to us in his individual capacity.
It's like I have to choose between my culture and the modern world. And it's tough because when I choose the modern world, I'm gaining so many privileges, and I'm gaining all of these privileges that I can't get through my culture, like, economically, socially. And I think that's because of discrimination against Indigenous culture that we're pressured to choose, and I don't think it should be that way.
Historical wrongs inflicted on Indigenous peoples by colonial powers continue to take their toll, triggering drug and alcohol abuse and domestic violence, which affect Indigenous youth. Compounded by discrimination, high levels of poverty, and unemployment, the UN says these factors may contribute to disproportionately high rates of suicide experienced by certain Indigenous peoples. Bill Means, a founder of the International Indian Treaty Council and an Oglala Lakota Sioux from South Dakota, told the UN Youth Center that despite efforts by parents, teachers, healers, doctors, and counselors to prevent youth suicide, in the first 4 months of this year, 15 young people from the Lakota Nation had taken their own lives.
Sometimes we're able to stop for a while, and then for some reason, it raises back up again. Like this year, between January and now, we have 15 suicide and over 30 attempts at suicide. We have no explanation because it crosses the pattern of economics, crosses the pattern of family stability.
Valmain Toki is an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and professor of law at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, of Ngāpuhi and Ngāti Maori descent. She said colonization had imposed a different worldview on the Maori peoples and had weakened traditional Indigenous family structures in her country, contributing to heightened rates of youth suicide.
In New Zealand, we were colonized, right? So the imposition of that differing worldview upon Māori, what that did is it broke down our traditional family or whānau structures, and this broke down the support, negative effects, so that traditional structure is no longer available to nurture and to help our people.
In education, too, Indigenous youth experience a sense of marginalization. Nicole Maria Yanes, a member of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus of the Opata tribe in Sonora, Mexico, explained, speaking in her individual capacity.
There's a lack of Indigenous recognition and representation in our educational systems where we're not being recognized, or non-Indigenous peoples aren't being taught of that we're still here, that Indigenous people still exist.
She added that a lack of Indigenous teachers and counselors deepens feelings of being disconnected. Victor Lopez Carmen from Tucson agreed.
We're taught in our history class a whole 6 months of colonial history, and sometimes not even 2 days on Native American or Indigenous history, and sometimes not at all. What we are taught about our history in classes is usually wrong and racist, and it's just not traditionally based at all.
Mining and other extractive industries pose additional threats to Indigenous communities, polluting and plundering the lands, rivers, and lakes on which Indigenous peoples depend for their lives and livelihoods, the UN says. This puts economic pressures on Indigenous youth, such as the reindeer herders of Sweden, said Per Jonas Partapule, a member of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus and president of Sami Noara, a Sami Swedish youth organization.
It's the state who decides what will happen with our lands. And since a lot of the Sami people live of reindeer husbandry, the land is really important. It's the grazing lands. So when you as a young reindeer herder see that, for example, a mine or some kind of exploration happens on your land, it's devastating.
Extractive industries can also bring to a community a host of social injustices and crimes, including sexual violence. Again, Nicole Maria Llanes of the Opata tribe in Mexico explained.
When a mining company or a fracking company or a extractive industry comes into our communities and sets shop, usually there's a lot of men that come into the community, and we call those man camps. And sometimes a lot of women, young women, children experience sexual violence, and that can cause so much trauma that it can become unbearable for those children and young women. And there's often not the programs available for them to heal.
Indigenous youth are less likely to receive adequate health care, including mental health care, than their mainstream contemporaries, as geographic and cultural isolation limit their access to services. And when they do get healthcare services, they often face a culture gap because doctors and practitioners may not be aware of Indigenous concerns. Periona Spartapule of the Sami Swedish Youth Organization explained.
If the person that you are meeting, a psychologist, for example, doesn't have the understanding, the cultural understanding, it's the opposite happening. You don't really get the help. You feel even more pain.
Adding to all of these long-standing factors, a relatively new element, social media, may be pushing young people to harm themselves when they fall victim to cyberbullying, belittling, racist slurs, and negative stereotypes. Victor Lopez Carmen of Tucson observed that social media is one of the only places where people can be openly racist and discriminatory without any repercussions to themselves.
Through Facebook, through stuff like that, you're not in the public eye, and the person can't really say anything about it because you get cyberbullied in a message or, in some way. You can't really do anything about it.
Asked what can be done to stop youth suicide now, Valmain Toki of New Zealand said,
There needs to be more of a meaningful engagement between Indigenous peoples and the state in terms of addressing these statistics. However, in saying that, in Aotearoa New Zealand we do have some initiatives that are family-focused or whānau-focused. We have a national program that we call Waka Haurua, and one component of this program is a national community suicide prevention program called Paiora. And this program uses cultural factors and encourages communities to build capacity to prevent and respond to instances of suicide. And I think that has to be positive.
The Permanent Forum is the UN Economic and Social Council's advisory body on Indigenous concerns. In its final report, it urged countries to increase human and financial resources to prevent youth self-harm and suicide. It also called on the UN system to develop strategies and programs to halt the trend. Again, Periona Spartapule of the Sami Swedish Youth Organization.
I hope that they will take this issue seriously, because it's a whole generation that we will lose. It's our future leaders, future fighters.